Good morning. I'm Judy Woodward, the History Coordinator of the Ramsey County Library, and it is my great pleasure to welcome you to this first talk as we resume the 2023 Great Decisions series. Our speaker today is Christi Siver, who will speak on the topic of war crimes. Christi Siver is a professor of political science at the College of St. Benedict and St. John's University. Her research interests include international humanitarian law, military technology, and comparative law. Today's program is brought to you through the co-sponsorship of the Osher Lifelong Learning Institute of the University of Minnesota, Global Minnesota, and the Foreign Affairs Association. We are deeply grateful to all these organizations. Thank you very much. And now I'd like to turn things over to our speaker, Christi Siver, on war crimes. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And I'll get my presentation. Oops, it's the beginning. So thank you so much for having me here today. I am very excited to be here, and I'm very I don't think it's proper to say I'm excited about talking about war crimes, but I think it's really important, and we've seen a lot of recent developments in the following years. So we'll jump into the topic, and I look forward to your questions at the end. The topics we'll cover today is I'll give you a little bit of background on the evolution of international humanitarian law, probably more colloquially known as the laws of war. We'll talk about the Nuremberg Tribunal and the creation of individual responsibility for crimes in war. We'll talk about more contemporary forums for international justice, and then we'll dive into Russia's special military operation. We'll talk about different options for accountability and the role of the United States. And then finally, we'll grapple with the difficult question of what happens if Russian leaders are never held accountable for their crimes. So I teach courses on ethics in war, and often the first question I'm asked when I tell people that is, aren't ethics in war an oxymoron? But that is actually not the case. And I'm not going to go through all of this history, but I just want to illustrate to you that scholars and leaders have been thinking about how to make war more humane, less deadly for a long period of time. We could go back to the Greco-Romans, and even then we see people fighting in wars, recognizing that there has to be some kind of restraint in battle. Probably what is most relevant to us today is that rebirth and World War II and the creation of the United Nations Charter. There are a couple of really important components of the UN Charter that I want to kind of give us a little bit of a foundation for then thinking about how we think about war. The United Nations Charter in Article 2, Section 4 says all members shall refrain in their international relations from the threat or use of force against the territorial integrity or political independence of any state or in any other manner inconsistent with the purposes of the United Nations. Now, Article 51 does reserve states the right to individual or collective self-defense. And the UN Charter also gives the United Nations Security Council the ability to use sanctions to sanction states that are violating the peace. And of course, Chapter 7, which allows for military interventions ordered by the United Nations. Now, the second important historical event that really kind of sets the groundwork for what we're going to be talking about today is the Nuremberg Tribunal. The Nuremberg Tribunal is the first establishment of a body to hold leaders individually responsible for their crimes of war. Prior to the Nuremberg Tribunal, as is mentioned in the briefing book, there were some nascent efforts to hold individual leaders accountable, but more often accountability was considered a state-to-state matter. However, I think leaders recognized after World War I and the devastating effect that reparations had in Germany, that there needed to be a more targeted means of holding people accountable so that it didn't create the conditions that would just allow for another world war. The Nuremberg Tribunal and the subsequent documents created the criminality of aggressive war, war crimes, and crimes against humanity. And crimes against humanity was a kind of a new crime at the time. It was a motion to treat crimes committed because of the race or religion of the victims, crimes against stateless persons, but it was limited to crimes that were connected to the planning or waging of war. That changes in more contemporary times. We also see the creation of the concept of genocide by Raphael Lemkin, who noted that genocide is a deliberate and systematic plan to wipe out people and cultures. The Nuremberg Tribunal also eliminated the defense of superior orders. So individuals could no longer say, well, I committed these crimes, but I committed them under the order of my senior officer. 12 defendants at Nuremberg were sentenced to death, 3 to life imprisonment, 4 to 10 to 20-year sentences, and 3 were acquitted. Now, I also want to talk about an important tribunal that occurred at the same time, which is the Tokyo War Crimes Tribunal. Often this tribunal kind of gets lost in the discussion of Nuremberg. At the Tokyo War Crimes Tribunal, 28 defendants, mostly imperial officers and government officials, were tried. 7 defendants were sentenced to death, 16 to life imprisonment. But what's also important to remember is that lower-ranking war criminals from World War II were tried in domestic courts. 140 of these criminals were tried in the United States, 236 were tried in the Netherlands, 223 were tried in the United Kingdom, 153 were tried in Australia, 149 were tried in China, 26 were tried in France, and 17 in the Philippines. So it's very important to remember that we've had international justice at multiple levels for a long time. Now, there are some concerns about the Nuremberg Tribunal that it represents victors' justice. Of course, the United States was not prosecuted for crimes in Japan, including the firebombing of Japanese cities and the use of nuclear weapons. The United Kingdom was not prosecuted for their city bombing attacks, which killed thousands of civilians throughout Germany. And Russia was not prosecuted for the Katyn massacre, in which 22,000 Polish military officers and prisoners of war were executed. So while the Nuremberg Tribunal represented an important step forward, it also was still limited by the notions of power that govern the international system and that still continue to govern the international system today. So what kinds of forums do we have for international justice now? You'll note that after the Nuremberg Tribunal, there's a pretty big gap in terms of any advances in holding individual leaders accountable. The Cold War really kind of divided world powers, and there was not the same kind of united cry for accountability for individual leaders causing harm to others or even their own civilians. However, after the Cold War, we see the creation of several important ad hoc tribunals. The first was the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia, which was created in 1993, and the International Criminal Tribunal for Rwanda, which was created in 1994. Both of these tribunals were created by the Security Council, and somewhat people argue as a means of kind of dealing with the fact that UN and other international intervention in these conflicts was either late or didn't happen at all. The International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia has finished its prosecution, so it is now closed. However, 161 individuals were indicted. 90 individuals were convicted and sentenced. 37 of those indictments were withdrawn or terminated. 13 defendants were referred to local trials, 19 were acquitted, 2 are in retrial, and the sentences are being enforced in 14 states throughout Europe. The International Criminal Tribunal for Rwanda continues to have an open mandate. 93 people have been indicted. Many of those have been convicted and sentenced, except for 14 that were acquitted and 2 indictment withdrawals. 1 died before trial. 4 of those criminals were referred to national jurisdiction, 6 remain at large, and there is 1 ongoing case. Now, the obvious tremendous resources that were involved in creating these 2 ad hoc tribunals created momentum for the creation of a permanent international criminal court. That International Criminal Court was created when the Rome Treaty was signed in 1998 and adopted by 120 states. 120 states are currently state parties. However, there are some notable non-signatories, including the United States, China, Iraq, Israel, Libya, Qatar, Yemen, India, Russia, and Sudan. So not necessarily a good group to be in. The International Criminal Court has a number of ways that it can launch investigations and prosecutions. It has jurisdiction over crimes in member states, or in the cases of crimes by member states, or cases can be referred to the International Criminal Court by the United Nations Security Council. There is also the possibility of prosecutorial initiative, but this has to be approved by a 3-judge panel in the court. The International Criminal Court has publicly indicted 52 people, and proceedings against 22 are ongoing. 16 of those individuals who have been indicted are at large. 1 is in a pretrial phase. 5 are on trial. There have been 10 convictions and 4 acquittals. There are also 17 ongoing investigations, including in the Democratic Republic of Congo, the Central African Republic, Georgia, and now Ukraine. What kinds of crimes are possible to be prosecuted at the International Criminal Court? So the International Criminal Court has a very limited mandate and can actually only try, at this current time, 3 crimes. The first is the crime of genocide, which I talked about earlier, which refers to any means with the intent to destroy in whole or in part a national, ethnic, or racial or religious group. The ICC can also try crimes against humanity, which include all of these crimes, but they must be part of a widespread or systematic attack against any civilian population. And one change that we see in the International Criminal Court is that these crimes can occur in peacetime. They no longer have to be limited to the time when a country is in a state of war. Finally, the ICC can try war crimes, which include grave breaches, mistreatment of civilians and prisoners of war, use of prohibited weapons, bombing of undefended towns and villages, and then also outrages upon human dignity, including rape, sexual slavery, forced prostitution, forced pregnancy, forced sterilization, and the conscription of children. Now, there's another kind that's actually very relevant in the situation in Ukraine, which is the crime of aggression. However, while the aggression is included in the Rome Treaty, there was a concession in the Rome Treaty that the parties could not agree on a definition of aggression. And so aggression cannot be tried at the International Criminal Court until there is more widespread agreement on the definition. In 2010, member states came together to create a definition. This is referred to as the Kampala Agreements, which refer to the planning, preparation, initiation, or execution of an act of aggression which by its character, gravity, and scale constitutes a manifest violation of the UN Charter. And that's that UN Charter, Article 2, Section 4, prohibition on the use of weapons. However, only a modest number of International Criminal Court member states have agreed to this definition. Only 43 of 123 have agreed to accept the court's jurisdiction over this crime. So that brings us to the discussion of Russia's special military operation. And this photo of Vladimir Putin comes from the speech that he gave on the 24th of February, 2022, where he argues that he is launching a special military operation in Ukraine at the request from the Donetsk and Luhansk regions. Those are the regions in eastern Ukraine that have actually been involved in conflict for some years. He argued that this special military operation was necessary to protect people who have been subjected to tortures and genocides, and that the goal of the operation was the demilitarization and denazification of Ukraine. It's important to remember, though, that the conflict in Ukraine did not start in 2022. In fact, it started much earlier in 2013 and 2014 when Ukraine experienced a massive overhaul of its government. In 2013, Viktor Yanukovych, who was the head of Ukraine, basically scuttled a deal that would have brought Ukraine closer to the European Union in favor of a deal that would have brought Ukraine closer to Russia. There were massive protests referred to as the Euromaidan. Viktor Yanukovych fled to Russia, and Ukraine went through a transformation and new elections to elect democratic governments. However, throughout this time, Russian forces, and you may remember this reference to little green men, remained in eastern Ukraine, and we saw, of course, the false plebiscite in Crimea that argued that they wanted to return to Russia, and then the annexation of Crimea by Russia. So these are kind of this lingering war that was taking people's lives, that was devastating the region, that existed for nearly 10 years before the war that we saw start in 2022. So I'll give you a bit of kind of an assessment of where the war is right now. You can see that Ukraine is quite outgunned in terms of military personnel in favor of Russia, but Russia has also taken massive military losses. Civilian casualties are estimated at 30,000. And, you know, obviously a tremendous amount of people have been killed. 904 die every day. 38 die per hour. So this is a war that is grinding through the forces that are trying to fight it. Russia's military budget clearly far outpaces that of Ukraine, which is why this foreign military aid, and you can see there that the United States is in the lead at 46.8 billion, is necessary for Ukraine to continue fighting the war. When we think specifically about war crimes, it's very important to look at what do we see systematically in terms of Russian armament. This map comes from ACLED, which is the Armed Conflict Location and Event Data Project. And they note that 40,000 acts of political violence have occurred in Ukraine since the start of the conflict. And they noted at this time and in this region, there were 5,000 reported civilian casualties, which they argued was a conservative estimate. But here you can see all of the cases of violence against civilians, the battles, and the explosions and remote violence. So even just in this one section of Ukraine, and I think it's important to note that this region of Zaporizhia, where there is a large nuclear plant that is currently being contested by Russia and Ukraine, so this eastern region has been a huge focus for both Russian and Ukrainian forces. However, when we think about how the conflict reaches into Western Ukraine, where many people have fled for safety, we do see quite a number of long-range strikes in both central and Western Ukraine. So it's clear that Russia is not limiting its use of firepower to places where they're actively engaged with military forces. They are very deliberately using long-range strikes to target at the heart of Ukraine's civilian population. It's also really important to note that evidence has been found that Russia has engaged in widespread abuse of women, including rape and forced nudity. The New York Times reported in January of 2023 that this evidence was overwhelming. They interviewed a Ukrainian investigator who said, "We are finding this problem of sexual violence in every place that Russia occupied. Every place, Kiev, Chernihiv, Kharkiv, Donetsk, and also here in Kherson." Iria Didenko, who leads the prosecutor's department investigating such crimes, has already opened 154 cases of conflict-related sexual violence. However, from the investigations and kind of the discussions with the victims that are coming forward, it is very difficult for these women to come forward in a relatively conservative culture. One victim told the Commission of Inquiry by the United Nations that this experience is very shameful for me, and I am extremely scared and humiliated. A psychologist working with survivors of sexual violence said, "All victims with whom I am working are blaming themselves for being spotted by perpetrators and being raped." So this issue of sexual violence is causing long-term damage in Ukraine. There's also the issue of violence against children. So NPR reported on February 13th of this year that Russia is operating a systematic network of at least 40 child custody centers for thousands of Ukrainian children who are being detained and deported. Nathaniel Raymond, who's the executive director of the Yale Humanitarian Research Lab, said, "It is a massive logistical undertaking that does not happen by accident." The United Nations Independent International Commission of Inquiry noted in October 2022 that the Office of the High Commissioner of Human Rights has verified the deaths of 112 children. They found evidence that Russia has confined children in inhumane conditions, and they have also found evidence of sexual violence. They also describe an event where, after an attack with explosive weapons in a residential area of Kharkiv, a mother described how the attack had impacted her daughter, saying she is very traumatized and will only sleep in the corridor. She also goes to the corridor every time she hears sirens during the daytime and starts to shake. So the long-term effects on Ukraine will be with us for some time, even if the conflict is brought to some kind of an end. So what are the options for accountability? The first option that we can go to is the International Court of Justice. The International Court of Justice is a body created by the UN Charter, which resolves state-to-state disputes. The international, so the Ukraine filed a case on February 25th, the day after the invasion, that Russia invaded its territory on false premises. And the International Court of Justice issued an emergency order on March 1st, 2022, ordering Russia to stop the war and cease all military operations in Ukraine. However, Russia has ignored the rulings of the International Court of Justice and has argued that they do not have jurisdiction over Russia's actions. So if we go further to the United Nations, there are two bodies within the United Nations that have the possibility of issuing rulings that would potentially constrain Russia. The most active of these bodies has been the United Nations General Assembly, in which all member states of the United Nations, I believe 195 now, have one vote. And the UN General Assembly voted to suspend Russia from the Human Rights Council in April of 2022, and more recently voted to ordering Russia to immediately, completely, and unconditionally withdraw all of its military forces from the territory of Ukraine and called for a cessation of hostilities. 141 states voted in favor of this resolution, but 7 states voted against it. Those 7 states are Belarus, North Korea, Eritrea, Mali, Nicaragua, Russia, and Syria. Again, not a good group that anyone would want to be in. Probably most notably, though, from this General Assembly vote was the 32 abstentions. And the 32 abstentions represent many countries in Africa and Latin America that are being encouraged by Russia and now China to, at the very least, stay out of the conflict. And those states are balancing their interests in receiving aid or other assistance from both Russia and China, and being aligned with the West. The most current resolution emphasizes the need for accountability for the most serious crimes under international law committed on the territory of Ukraine through appropriate, fair, and independent investigations and prosecutions at the national or international level, and ensure justice for all victims and the prevention of future crimes. UN General Assembly resolutions, while representative of international public opinion, however, are not binding on states. The United Nations Security Council, which is made up of 15 states, 5 of which are permanent members and have veto power. You probably know who these are: the United States, the United Kingdom, France, China, and Russia have. The United Nations Security Council has been very weak in terms of its response. And that is largely because both Russia and China have continued to divert these discussions. The UN Security Council, while it has tried to address this issue, it has held more than 40 debates since Russia's invasion, has not yet been able to agree on any resolutions. So then we come to the criminal court, where we have seen more action, particularly in recent days. On March 17th, the International Criminal Court issued arrest warrants for Vladimir Putin and Maria Lvova-Belova, who is the Commissioner for Children's Rights in Russia, for the abduction and deportation of thousands of Ukrainian children. This arrest warrant is noteworthy because Vladimir Putin joins, again, not a very good club of former Serbian President Slobodan Milosevic and also Muammar Gaddafi as being the sole leaders ever indicted in an international criminal court. Sir Jeffrey Nice, KC, who led the prosecution in the trial of former Serbian President Milosevic, said the warrant would change how foreign leaders view Mr. Putin. He will remain an alleged criminal until and unless he submits himself for trial or is handed over for trial and acquitted. That seems extremely unlikely, so he will remain an alleged criminal until the end of his life. On March 23rd, the Prosecutor General of Ukraine and the Registrar of the International Criminal Court signed a cooperation on the establishment of an ICC country office in Ukraine. So the ICC will now have a field office in Ukraine from which to do investigations. Now, you might be wondering, why is the ICC able to investigate crimes within Ukraine? Because neither Russia nor Ukraine are member states of the ICC. However, Ukraine consented to ICC jurisdiction in 2014, and the situation in Ukraine was referred to the International Criminal Court by 43 member states. The ICC opened its investigation on March 2nd of 2022 and has been focusing on crimes both in the contemporary conflict and going back to the original conflict that began in 2013 and 2014. However, the International Criminal Court, while it is able to indict and then hopefully try individuals for commission of war crimes, it does not have an international police. So it will depend on member states to basically arrest and extradite individuals under arrest warrants at the ICC, and it is unclear whether that will ever happen if Vladimir Putin does not travel to an ICC member state. Another option for accountability is the Human Rights Council. So the Human Rights Council was created by the United Nations to investigate and receive complaints of human rights violations from groups or individuals. They opened a commission of inquiry upon Russia's invasion of Ukraine. And this is the most powerful tool that the United Nations Human Rights Council has. It is focused on the violations of the rights of children and other vulnerable populations. They released an initial report in October of 2022 that found sufficient evidence that Russian armed forces were responsible for war crimes, violations of human rights, and violations of international humanitarian law. And their most recent report, which was released in March 15th of 2023, states that the body of evidence shows that Russian authorities have committed a wide range of violations of international human rights law and international humanitarian law in many regions of Ukraine and the Russian Federation. Many of these amount to war crimes and include willful killings, attacks on civilians, unlawful confinement, torture, rape, and forced transfers, and deportations of children. While the Human Rights Council can issue this report and share its investigatory evidence with other international legal bodies, there is not any specific action that the Human Rights Council can take other than to continue to investigate and collect evidence. Probably the most active judicial body in this situation has been Ukraine's judicial system. So domestic courts have been focused on direct perpetrator crimes. These would probably be like the lower level criminals, from, soldiers to their unit commanders. 26 war crime suspects have been tried and convicted of rape, murder, shelling of residential infrastructure, cruel treatment, and pillaging. 276 people have been charged. Now, one kind of unique issue that is a constraint in Ukraine's prosecution of crimes is that Ukrainian law prevents the introduction of evidence not collected by Ukrainian investigators. So that means that Ukrainian courts are limited just by the amount of resources and the amount of investigators that Ukraine in a state has. So other international bodies that are gathering evidence, that information cannot be used in Ukraine courts at this time to help prosecute these crimes. Other options for prosecution of war criminals and war crimes violations in this conflict include the European Court of Human Rights. So the European Court ruled on the 25th of January, so even before the invasion, that it can hear Ukraine's complaint against Russia for its actions in eastern Ukraine. And this case referred specifically to the 2014 Russian downing of the Malaysian Airlines flight. But they also ruled that they could hear cases regarding unlawful military aggression against civilians and civilian objects. So this is this kind of war that was happening from 2014 on before the additional aggression in 2022. However, Russia has refused to follow the ruling and ended European Court of Human Rights jurisdiction over its actions. The European Union has also created the Agency for Criminal Justice and Cooperation, Eurojust, which has a core international crimes evidence database. They are collecting that evidence and providing it to judicial bodies like the International Criminal Court for use in their prosecutions. The Office of the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe also has an Office for Democratic Institutions and Human Rights, which has opened a Ukraine monitoring initiative. In their second interim report filed on the 14th of December in 2022, they ruled that credible evidence that the conduct of hostilities by Russian Federation has continued to be characterized by a general disregard for the basic principles of distinction, proportionality, and precautions set out by international humanitarian law, which may amount to war crimes and crimes against humanity, and which has led to the tremendous loss of civilian life and widespread suffering over the course of the conflict. It is possible, particularly as the conflict continues, for states to use the concept of universal jurisdiction to try individuals in their own domestic courts. So under the concept of universal jurisdiction, there are some crimes that are just so heinous that they can be tried in any domestic court around the world. There have been investigations opened in Germany, Spain, Sweden, France, Lithuania, Canada, Poland, Estonia, Latvia, Slovakia, the United States, and the United Kingdom. Now, the last potential option, and this is something that President Zelensky and the head of EU, Ursula von der Leyen, have been working on, is the creation of a special ad hoc court. And Zelensky is in favor of this special ad hoc court because he is primarily interested in trying Russia for the crime of aggression, something that the ICC is not yet able to do. So this would create some kind of specialized court to try Russia's crimes in Ukraine. The European Union in November of 2022 proposed options for setting up this specialized court to try Russian war crimes in Ukraine. But they're kind of waiting to see if the United Nations will support the creation of this kind of hybrid court. The plan, which was announced by von der Leyen, is a response to Ukrainian calls for the creation of a special tribunal to prosecute Russian leaders for the invasion. And von der Leyen said, Russia must pay for its historic crimes, including for its crime of aggression against a sovereign state. However, all of these actions are still in early stages. So what is the role for the United States? So the United States is not a signatory to the International Criminal Court, and in fact has opposed becoming a signatory, and in the past has opposed even sharing information with the International Criminal Court. However, when the arrest warrants were issued against Putin and Belova, Biden said he supported the ICC action and that the administration wants to send evidence to the ICC to assist in their prosecution. On March 28th, U.S. senators from both Republicans and Democrats sent a joint letter to the Biden administration, which urged them to share information with the ICC. In fact, the joint letter stated, last year's bipartisan congressional action to enhance the support that the ICC needs was done in collaboration with the Biden administration to balance all perspectives on the U.S. relationship with the ICC. Yet months later, as the ICC is working to build cases against Russian officials, including Putin himself, the U.S. reportedly has not shared key evidence that could aid in these prosecutions. And I think it's particularly noteworthy that this joint letter included Richard Durbin from Illinois, and also Lindsey Graham from South Carolina, who has been overwhelmingly critical of the Defense Department's opposition to sending the information to the ICC. In fact, Graham was quoted, "It seems to me that DOD is the problem child here, and the sooner we can get the information into the hands of the ICC, the better off the world will be." So while the United States has not ratified the Rome Treaty and is not a member state of the ICC, the U.S. has allowed and even supported UN Security Council referrals of the situation in Darfur and Libya to the ICC, and also supported the transfer of a Congolese rebel leader and a Lord's Resistance Army commander to the ICC for trial. The United States State Department has created the Atrocity Crimes Advisory Group, which has sent experts to Kyiv assisting in the prosecution. The Department of Justice created the War Crimes Accountability Team. As Attorney General Garland traveled to Ukraine on March 21st, and he focused on the U.S.'s supporting role, providing Ukraine's overburdened prosecutors and police with logistical help, training, and direct assistance in bringing charges of war crimes by Russians in Ukraine's court. Also notably, Garland appointed Eli Rosenbaum, who is both a veteran prosecutor at the Department of Justice, who previously led efforts to find and try Nazi war criminals, to head up this War Crimes Accountability Team. The State Department has also played a role creating a conflict observatory. This captures, analyzes, and makes widely available evidence of Russian perpetrated war crimes and other atrocities in Ukraine. And this is in partnership with ESRI, a leading GIS company, Yale University's Humanitarian Research Lab, the Smithsonian Cultural Rescue Initiative, and PlanetScape AI. So the U.S. Could do more, and hopefully this additional pressure of the joint letter from Congress will overcome Defense Department opposition to sharing information with the International Criminal Court. The Defense Department's opposition is grounded in concerns that were raised during the original creation of the International Criminal Court, that U.S. soldiers could be brought before the court and tried. I'm happy to answer questions about that because it seems extremely unlikely that that would happen. But of course, the U.S. has not yet moved to provide this additional assistance to the ICC. All of the possible efforts to achieve justice for the victims of Russia's aggression in Ukraine will take years, if not decades, to come to fruition. And it is entirely possible, and I think almost likely, that we will not necessarily ever see Vladimir Putin held in the dock the same way that German leaders were at Nuremberg. And how do we reconcile that? Does it make all of these efforts that are being done to collect evidence on war crimes pointless or meaningless? I would argue no. There are a couple of efforts that could lead to justice for the victims in Ukraine. The current precedent at the International Criminal Court is that trials only happen when a person is physically in the courtroom. However, current prosecutor Karim Khan has filed an argument to move forward with the trial of Joseph Kony, who is part of the Lord's Resistance Army in Uganda, in absentia. And the court has not yet ruled on that. That would allow potentially for Putin to be tried in absentia, which would just put further limitations on Putin and his movements internationally. It's also important to recognize that Vladimir Putin is a pariah. If we think about those 25 to 30 states that abstained from the General Assembly resolution, they are now put in a position of not taking a stance on someone who has been indicted of war crimes by the International Criminal Court. And so this just creates greater pressure on Putin and on these states to basically condemn Russia's actions in the war. Stephen Wolf, who's a professor of international security at the University of Birmingham, also raised the importance of both hearing the testimonies of these victims, but also being prepared to address the trauma of this conflict for many, many years. He said that helping citizens deal with the trauma they have experienced means building culturally relevant local capacity for victims and survivors to organize, identify, and advocate for their specific needs. There will need to be support for women and women-led households. Eventually, locally driven, truth-seeking efforts will be necessary for people to live together safely again. So we will have to continue to be creative in trying to find accountability and justice, but we also need to make sure we are directing our attention to those who are the victims of these crimes and making sure that they get both the physical, emotional, and mental support that they need. I'll stop there and open up the possibility for questions.
Thank you very much, Professor Christi Siver. We do have some questions in the Q&A line, but it looks like we have room for more. So I will say to the audience, now is your chance to go ahead and put your questions in, and I will get right to them. Okay, it seems like there's a number of questions that really are on this topic. Basically, it's why didn't the United States sign on to the International Criminal Court? Why do we not belong to it?
Yes, that's an excellent question. So the United States were actually leaders at the Rome Treaty, and so therefore very instrumental in the creation of the International Criminal Court. So President Clinton at the time in 1998 signed the Rome Treaty, but then came back to the United States, sensed that there was quite a bit of opposition from Republicans, and never sent the treaty to Congress for ratification, which is what's required by the Supreme Court in the United States. When President Bush took power after President Clinton, then he actually went through a ceremony of unsigning the treaty, which is not actually a concept of international law. The primary objections to the United States signing the ICC relate to this concern that U.S. service members would be tried at an international court. In fact, the Congress passed the American Service Members Protection Act, which has also been called the Hague Invasion Act, which would not only prevent the United States from transferring soldiers to the court for prosecution, but would actually order the military to conduct an intervention if U.S. soldiers were ever happened to be at the court facing trial. So this speaks to the strength of particularly Republican opposition to this treaty. However, I will say that over bipartisan administrations, under the Obama administration, under the Trump administration, under the Biden administration, there has been no real discussion of the U.S. signing on to the International Criminal Court. So this move to share information in the case of Ukraine is really important and perhaps opens a door to the United States becoming more comfortable with joining the court, but I still think it's unlikely. I'll tell you the reason that I think that this concern is unfounded. The International Criminal Court operates off a concept of complementarity, which basically means the International Court only intervenes in cases where domestic courts are unable or are willing to try the alleged war criminals. The United States has a very well-developed and very effective unified code of military justice, and we do try soldiers for alleged war crimes. So I don't believe that the Defense Department's concerns are founded, but that has carried the day so far, and it's creating division within the Biden administration, which insiders say actually really wants to share this information with the ICC, but they're having a hard time overcoming Defense Department opposition.
Okay. Would it be possible under the terms of the treaty for the United States to join the ICC later, or is that window been closed?
Yes, no, definitely. The U.S. always could go through the process of acceding to the International Criminal Court, or it could simply reverse the unsigning of the trial of the treaty. But then it would have to be sent to the Senate for ratification. So there'd have to be bipartisan support for that in order to achieve that threshold for ratification.
The next questioner asks for clarification of the term forced pregnancy. How does this differ from rape? What is this?
It doesn't necessarily differ from rape. It's the use of sexual violence with the intent to cause harm to an ethnic group by forcing a member of one ethnic group to have a baby of another ethnic group. So it really is designed to both humiliate the woman who is raped and thus impregnated and then forced to carry the child to term, but it's also designed to be humiliating to men because they can't protect women. So this is unfortunately a tactic we've seen in ethnically driven wars in the former Yugoslavia, in Rwanda, in the Central African Republic, where there are lots of gendered assumptions about how ethnicity travels between men and women and children. And that has been used by groups as a deliberate effort to create harm to women, but to also, it's an example of a type of genocide because it's designed to weaken an ethnic group and ethnic identity.
This question of ethnic identity raises another issue. To outsiders, the cultural similarities between Russians and Ukrainians seem so present. The language is so similar, the culture is so similar, they share a religion. Do they see each other? I mean, even before the war, did they see each other as battling ethnicities? They don't acknowledge any similarities with each other?
So I think prior to the war, there actually was there was quite a bit of kinship. I think that Vladimir Putin, through various propaganda efforts, has made an effort to create. He's kind of done a couple of things that are interesting. He's been arguing this concept of genocide for quite some time, that the Ukrainians who have a historical affiliation with the National Socialists in Germany and the Nazis, and that's only true to a limited extent, basically are trying to wipe out ethnic Russians. Of course, both countries were part of the USSR during the Cold War. And there were a lot of ethnic Russians living in Ukraine, and there were a lot of Ukrainians living in Russia. I think we really saw what Vladimir Putin was aiming to do when he wrote an essay basically arguing that the identity of Ukraine did not exist, and that actually all of the good people in Ukraine were Russians and all of the bad people were Nazis. And so the challenge with ethnicity is that it is a social construction, right? It's a construction. So what we've seen in the last couple of years are Ukrainians, taking greater and greater pride in cultural aspects, and this includes music, history, art, that they feel are unique to their historical tradition. And they're asserting themselves that we are not Russians, right? That we have identity. So while there are, this is kind of the strange thing about ethnicity. Ukraine has been and not been a part of Russia throughout history. Like the map has changed in that region quite a bit over time. And yet, but the war has really driven people apart, including within families.
Yeah.
And I think that's what's really so devastating about it. And it's what leads a lot of people to kind of try to understand what Putin's motivation is. But it seems as though he has this aim of rebuilding the Russian Empire. And in order to do that, Ukraine is kind of a first piece of that. And to bring Ukraine back into the fold, he basically is trying to argue that Ukraine never existed and that it has always been Russian.
Yeah. Okay. All right. What is the definition of war? Says this questioner. World War II officially started with a declaration of war, but now war seems to be quite liberally used to cover any fighting between powers within and without a country, and without any necessary formal declarations.
Yeah, this is such a good question. So there are a number of different ways that it can be answered. I think if we think back to perhaps the Cold War time and back to World War I and World War II, we thought of wars as wars between states over things like territory, that were fought by soldiers lining up on a battlefield and fighting each other. Very clearly if the post-Cold War world didn't change that, then 9/11 changed that forever, right? And so war is a difficult thing to nail down. In fact, I go back and forth with my students all the time about this. If we think about the way political scientists define war, a lot of times they say a conflict where there are multiple parties, so at least more than two, or at least two or more, that involve at least 1,000 people being killed. So that is kind of like a threshold for war. I think war is a tricky concept because, we think about a war on terrorism, but that's a war on idea. We think about cyber warfare, right? Which is, warfare literally in cyberspace. So I don't, part of this question, I wonder if it's getting at this issue that we don't declare war anymore, which is really interesting timing in light of the fact that I believe the Senate just voted to finally end the Iraq war authorization, which has been ongoing for a long time. But yeah, we've kind of moved away from declarations of war. And that's what, Putin did declare this special military operation. And he, obviously people in Russia who talk about war are being given extraordinary jail sentences. And yet in his speech this year, kind of giving Russians an update on the war, he did use the word war sometimes. So I think in some ways, Ukraine, I think in the 1990s, we got used to looking at civil wars and ethnic conflicts. But I think in some ways, Ukraine is the contemporary example of an interstate war that we just had. We hadn't seen that for a long time. And now it feels like we're going backward in terms of the way states try to achieve their goals.
Let me see. Would Putin be subject to arrest if he left Russia?
If he went to a state that was a signatory to the International Criminal Court, yes. And so Obviously Putin's not going to go to France or other states that are very active in the
Mhm,
International Criminal Court. But there have been some suggestions that, what if Putin wanted to visit a country like South Africa? And
mhm,
would some of these smaller states that are signatory states to the International Criminal Court be willing to arrest him? And this is a
mhm,
very controversial that gets at that kind of victor's justice question that I raised with Nuremberg, because the ICC, most of its investigations and prosecutions have been in Africa, have been in the global South. And so there
mhm,
are a lot of countries, in fact, Uganda referred the case of their civil war and Joseph Kony and the Lord's Resistance Army's recruitment of child soldiers to the International Criminal Court, but then tried to rescind that referral because it was
mhm,
complicating negotiations with the Lord's Resistance Army to try and end the civil war. And so there
mhm,
is a lot of frustration, particularly amongst African countries, that the court has been used to target them and doesn't target the United States, doesn't target Israel, doesn't target other countries that commit violations that could be tried at the ICC. And so that will be really interesting if Putin tries to test, medium to smaller states' willingness to enforce international law. So it's
mhm,
possible if he traveled to a state that was an ICC member, they're
mhm.
obligated by treaty to arrest and send him to The Hague.
Sure. Okay. Then the next questionnaire says, when the Human Rights Council says Russian authorities have committed crimes, does that mean that the authorities ordered the crimes to be committed, or does it mean that they allowed soldiers in the chain of command to commit crimes without express approval or express um, volition?
Yeah, that's a great question. So that is where war crimes differs from crimes against humanity. War crimes can be committed by soldiers and they are bad acts and they should be
Mhm,
tried, right? But they're not part of a systematic deliberate effort. I think what
mhm,
we're seeing with crimes against humanity and what the Human Rights Council has seen is that this didn't all just happen by accident, that this is part of an intentional and systematic effort to terrorize civilians. And unfortunately,
mhm,
this is a strategy we've seen many times before. This was the strategy of strategic bombing that the British used during World War II, right? They thought, well, if we terrorize the German civilians, they will rise up and demand that Hitler end the war. We know that this never works, right? Like political scientists have studied case after case after case, and these tactics of targeting civilians do not work in ending the war, but they do impose terrible amounts of devastation. But the Human Rights Council in this case is saying this is a systematic effort. And that is based on that evidence from the Yale Humanitarian Lab that
mhm,
noted that, the deportations of children in particular, this is the ICC case, that is ordered from the top. And part of the
mhm,
reason the ICC chose this case is because this is something that Putin has bragged about. He has a
mhm,
whole propaganda campaign
mhm.
surrounding bringing these children to Russia and having them adopted out to Russian families. So it is
Yeah.
an easy case per se, but no, their argument is that this is a deliberate and systematic effort to target civilian morale.
And I think this isn't the first time that the Russian army has been after World War II. The Russian army had a much worse reputation as an occupier of former Nazi countries than the British or the Americans. Why is that? What is it within Russian culture that permits them to use civilian terror as a authorized method of combat?
Yeah, I'm reluctant to attribute it to Russian culture. I would say these are deliberate acts of Russian leaders.
Mhm,
Because I think you saw Stalin, commit horrific crimes against his own people, against people in Poland. What we now see is Putin, Putin greatly admires the old Russian Empire. These tactics that Russia is using in Ukraine, the generals that Putin has elevated are the same generals who use this exact strategy in Syria. So we have seen, so I would say, I don't think this is necessarily a Russian cultural issue. I think this is about authoritarian leaders who have visions of empire and enforce it at any cost, right? I'm not sure there is a civilian cost at which Putin would be willing to stop using these efforts.
Yeah. You talked about trying or the possibility of trial before the ICC in absentia. So could this happen to Putin? Do you think there's any likelihood that Putin would be tried in absentia?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. The document or the claim that Khan filed before the court to try Joseph Kony would be a huge change for the International Criminal Court. They have always had a precedent of trying leaders in person. Now, using universal jurisdiction, some countries have decided to try leaders in absentia and provide these are mostly in civilian cases that are in civil cases that provide money damages. And so then the victims can pursue those money damages through all kinds of means. Do I think Putin can be tried? I think it's possible, but it probably will take a lot of time and foregoing a lot of other, eliminating all other opportunities to hold him to account. Because I think that would make, when you think about what makes the United States nervous about prosecutorial initiative and individuals coming before the court, I think it would make the United States very nervous to see a precedent that someone could be tried in absentia, because because then the American Service Members Protection Act doesn't protect, as well as it did before. Yeah. So I think it's possible, but it would definitely take the elimination of many, many other alternatives.
Yeah. How do the courts distinguish between civilian infrastructure and military infrastructure? There doesn't seem to be a clear divide to me, says this questioner.
Yeah. So in Ukraine, it has, civilian infrastructure are things like apartment buildings, also churches and schools. Any place where children are have special protection, right? So churches, schools, but then large apartment buildings, the kind that we've seen in the media coverage of Ukraine. These are very clearly not military targets, right? There are targets, and then of course, if you see bunkers or weapons storage depots, those are very clearly military targets. Also, if you have dug-in soldiers, fortifications, barracks, those are very clearly military targets. What does get tricky are things like communication, because of course that can be used by civilians, but it can also be used by the military. In the case of Russia, though, they have very deliberately launched particularly long-range attacks against, these neighborhoods, right? And a thing about civilian targeting is that the rule in international law is that you absolutely cannot target civilians. Like, there is no case in which targeting civilians is lawful. The kind of caveat to that is called the doctrine of double effect, which says if you have a military target and it's right next to a civilian target, but the military target is so important, but that civilian damage is foreseeable and likely, that might be okay, right? It kind of leaves open that possibility. But in this case, targeting apartment buildings, targeting civilian neighborhoods, that is very clear, right? So that's where I think justice will come, are these acts that are very, very obvious. They're not going to pursue kind of cases kind of close in the middle there with those kinds of dual use facilities, they're going to move forward with things like a tax on large apartment buildings and such.
Okay, the next questioner says, this week, Pope Francis disowned the so-called doctrine of discovery. For those of us who are not familiar, could you briefly describe the doctrine of discovery? And then the question is, do you think the United States should overturn Supreme Court decisions, repeal laws, etc., based on the doctrine of discovery?
So my understanding of the doctrine of discovery is that the doctrine of discovery justify what was the Catholic Church efforts to justify colonial ventures to supposedly discover new lands. So this is a huge victory, symbolically at least, for Indigenous peoples all around the world. Now, a lot of what, and this is a little bit outside of my wheelhouse, but I'll say what I can.
Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah. The Supreme Court is actually going to make a couple of decisions in the coming term that are really important for Indigenous rights, particularly Native peoples in the United States. And some of those relate to whether being Native American is a national identity or a racial identity. And so I think that this Francis's, kind of renouncement of the doctrine of discovery is a reminder, kind of in our contemporary mind, that we didn't discover America, right? There were people living here already, and so I think hopefully it causes us to take a moment of pause about what we tell people how they can identify. And in some ways, when we think about what Putin's trying to do with his imperial aims, he's really telling Ukrainians, you're not who you say you are. Mm-hmm. And so we should be cautious about using our power, which we have, right? The US has, which Russia has, which China has. We should be cautious about using that power to tell people who they are or who they should be. But I think that's where I have to stop because it is a little bit out of my area of expertise.
Thank you. Thank you. Putin has constantly used the theme of identifying the Ukrainians with Nazism. That seems ludicrous on the face of it. Zelensky is Jewish, for example. Mm-hmm. But what is, if any, the historical context of that charge?
Yeah, so when you think about this region, and there's a similar history invoked often in the former Yugoslavia, in the countries of the former Yugoslavia. There were fighters in Western Ukraine who identified with Nazis. In some ways, the history that I've been able to glean suggests that was motivated by their fear of the Russians. And so they feared being overtaken by Russians. And so they allied with, the enemy of the enemy is my friend, and they allied with Nazis. I don't know that they necessarily bought into Nazi ideology. I think they thought we're getting stuck between these two powers that's chewing everyone up in the middle of it. And so they allied with that. In 2014, there was kind of a rising nationalist socialist element that was part of the Euromaidan protests. It was always a minority presence, right? So in some ways, that's the problem with conspiracy theories is there are always a kernel of truth to them. So did some Ukrainians have a past affiliation with Nazis? Yes. Did they fight for Hitler? Yes. Is that representative of contemporary Ukraine? No. Right. And so, but it's a convenient propaganda tool that Putin can use. And I think he's kind of, first of all, he recognizes the power of information warfare. We saw that in the 2016 election here. And he has used information warfare to kind of set the stage in Ukraine. RT, which is a Russian media agency, set up Russian language television was still commonly watched in Ukraine. And so RT kind of laid the narrative of this kind of genocidal story before the invasion ever began. And so unfortunately that is that's where that comes from. But yes, I think the powerful part of that is that it seems kind of ludicrous on face. It's like you could, but it's very common for leaders when they're trying to achieve their goals to kind of try and rewrite historical narratives.
So do these narratives, are they working with the Russian people? Does the war remain popular with the people of Russia?
That's a great question. So one of the hardest things about understanding what's going on in Russia at this point is that there are so few Western journalists in Russia. And in fact, the arrest of the Wall Street Journal reporter, just suggests that's going to be even less, right? The United States, Karine Jean-Pierre, in her press conference yesterday said, the United States does not support any US citizens being in Russia because of the risk. However, my sense from all of the journalism that has come out is that some Russians, particularly there's kind of a generational divide. I think older Russians are supportive of Putin, but a lot of younger Russians kind of started out in the war thinking, well, I don't really agree with it, but it also isn't impacting my life. I think then when we saw the partial mobilization and men starting to get rounded up on the streets, people started taking it more seriously. There's been a mass exodus of Russian men from Russia. And also, I think people are afraid. But of course, we saw actually, I think it was in the last week or so, a father be convicted of, anti-government rhetoric for his daughter drawing a picture that was celebrating Ukraine, and he fled to safety, but his daughter has been put in an orphanage. He's lost his child. So I think the repression is so heavy in Russia that people are just afraid. The people who remain are afraid to say anything. And so it's very difficult. And now that there'll be even fewer Western journalists in Russia, we'll know even less about Russian public opinion.
What about the economic penalties that have been imposed by Western countries, well, by many countries on Russia? Are they taking effect? And are there other additional economic penalties that could be imposed?
Yeah, this is a really great question. I actually had my class debate the effect of sanctions on Russia just last week. The sanctions are having an effect, and what they are effectively doing is they are denying Russia. So they're denying Russia access to, for example, semiconductor chips, which are very important for military technology, and they're diverting all of their resources into producing weapons. So that means they're not producing other things, which will affect their exports down the road. In order to get the semiconductor chips that they need to build their weaponry, they're having to import really odd things like cell phones and refrigerators. So they're importing other things that have chips, which is really expensive and super wasteful. And they're importing most of these through third-party states, like some of the Central Asian states, Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, Kyrgyzstan. And so the question is, like, how long can they keep that up? Russia has burned through a lot of its foreign currency reserves. So it does seem like there will be a limit to this. And also some of the companies whose refrigerators are, being imported to Russia and then being stripped for their semiconductors. Those companies, and one example that I've heard about is Bosch, do not want their refrigerators ending up in Russia because they know what's happening is that they're just taking the semiconductors. So they are trying to be more strict about their exports. So you kind of have a potential for more pain coming on that end. But you also have these third countries like Kyrgyzstan and Kazakhstan. And I think I heard specifically about Kazakhstan is kind of trying to crack down on these kind of shady imports into into Russia. And so it's taking effect, but it's probably not going to cause, it's going to cause pain, but it's going to take some time. I think the real question is, especially as we come out of winter, do we target Russia's oil market more seriously? And of course, Europe and the United States haven't done that for a number of reasons. Europe's heavily dependent on Russian oil, and the United States doesn't want to see a massive disruption to oil prices. But that would be the key. That would deny Russia access to foreign currency, which would deny Russia the ability to buy even refrigerators on the global market. And so Russia has complained. So one kind of side note to that is that Russia and Ukraine are obviously tremendous exporters of grain, which is critical to both their economies, but also to world humanitarian aid. And so the very survival and prevention of starvation amongst many countries throughout the world. The grain agreement that was the Black Sea agreement that was achieved with the assistance of Turkey was recently renewed. There was kind of some concern because the renewal date was March 20th, whether it would be renewed. It has been renewed, but there's dispute about whether it's only for 60 or 120 days. And one of the arguments that Russia is making about that is that the economic sanctions are causing problems in their agricultural markets and they're causing food shortages, which the sanctions do not target humanitarian items like food and medicine. But Russia's saying, well, but we can't get them because we don't have the money. And so that's not fair. We won't keep doing this grain deal if you don't give us some sanctions relief. So it'll be interesting to see how that conversation continues, because keeping the Black Sea ports open is critical to addressing famine and humanitarian crises all around the world.
The next questioner, I guess you could say, brings some of these issues home. This person says, if Putin is responsible for what his military personnel perpetrate during this war, is not the United States president at the time of war also guilty in that he was the ultimate authority that condoned My Lai in Vietnam, for example, or Abu Ghraib, or waterboarding?
That is a really good question. I think would have to be determined case by case. In the case of Putin, he announced the military operation. He's directly appointed, Russian generals who, cut their teeth in places like Syria. He's specifically ordered the seizing and deportation of children. In those cases, it's very clear that he's made decisions that for which he should be held accountable. If we think about a case like My Lai, I think there is an argument maybe that the structures that the president put in place, things like body count as a measurement of unit success, they could be held accountable for, but the responsibility is a little bit less direct. If you want to talk about waterboarding or the detention of prisoners at Guantanamo Bay, that is those two examples are very solidly in President Bush's hands. Like, he made decisions. He said this was okay. He signed presidential directives. There are investigations and probably pending prosecutions in a number of national courts using universal jurisdiction. But those, and I mean, this isn't necessarily a good thing, But countries like Germany or Spain, who have been very active in using universal jurisdiction to prosecute crimes, are not willing to risk their relationship with the United States to put President Bush under prosecution. But Donald Rumsfeld has been made a target for possible prosecution. And so some US leaders, particularly that were involved in those early days of the war on terrorism, in the Iraq and Afghanistan wars, they are cautious about where they travel in Europe.
Really?
So it doesn't mean that they're going to get prosecuted, right? Which should happen. I mean, there should be justice. There should be a trial. There should be a real adjudication of it. But power still matters. So I don't disagree with this person. But I think it does depend a little bit case by case.
Yeah. Well, we have about 10 minutes left, and we now have more outstanding questions than we had at the beginning of the discussion. We're unfortunately not going to get to all the questions, but we will try to power through and get to as many as possible. Is there any process to remove a permanent member of the Security Council at the UN should its leader be charged, for example, with war crimes? Could that possibly be done? Has that ever happened at the UN?
It has never happened, and that would require a vote of the Security Council on which that member would have a veto. I think it's very unlikely.
Yeah, okay. Is Putin, this person wants to know if Putin is possibly Ukrainian or Georgian. Where was he born?
I believe that Putin was born in St. Petersburg. So some of the motivation for Putin has to do with he always wanted to be a KGB agent his whole life. The frontline documentaries on this are really quite good. And he was working for the KGB when the Berlin Wall fell. He wasn't in Berlin, he was in Dresden, I believe. And he felt really abandoned by the USSR's leadership during this time of the Cold War. So I think that's where his visions of Russian empire come from.
Okay. I'm curious about the inability to agree on a definition of aggression, says this questioner. It seems obvious. What drives the reluctance around creating a definition?
Good question. Like many terms, I think that countries disagree on the definition of aggression because the real issue is the threshold question. Like if I come out, like for example, the United States will occasionally do operations across the Mexican border related to drug war. Is that aggression? What the United States did with Osama bin Laden, it entered Pakistan without Pakistan's approval to capture bin Laden and then ultimately execute him and bury him at sea. Is that aggression, right? I think in a lot of cases, and aggression also does involve intent too. And so that is why there has been so much vision about it. I think the division is really over the threshold question, like when does military action become aggression, has been the problem. So I think that's the source of the dispute. Like easy cases are easy cases. When Putin says I'm launching a special military operation, he sends a bunch of Russian soldiers across the border that we can see on satellites. So that's one thing, right? But there are lots of cases in which it might be less clear cut.
Sure. This questioner says the Russian army has sustained significant casualties. I'm thinking about a book, the person says, called Zinky Boys, that talks about how the mothers of dead Russian soldiers effectively pressured Russia to get out of Afghanistan. Are there any similar movements in Russia today, particularly Russian mothers movements?
Yes, there are. And there's been some fabulous coverage of this by NPR's podcast, Rough Translations. They were in Ukraine since 2014, and they've done some coverage. Some mothers who have had their sons conscripted in the mobilization, they were told that their sons would not be deployed to Ukraine, that they would only do domestic operations, and like basically the other soldiers would then be sent to Ukraine. Mothers who have found out that their sons have been sent to Ukraine have banged on regional military offices, demanded that their sons be returned. So yes, it exists, but of course the level of repression in Russia means it cannot be at the level that the questioner is asking about. That did play a huge role. I do think as more and more Russians come back in body bags, that there may be a tipping point at which Russians are willing to pay the punishment for speaking out against their government, but we just haven't gotten there yet. I think the use of the Wagner Group and the use of Russian prisoners in the war was like a way to kind of like avoid this. But I mean, because Putin knows the mobilization was hugely unpopular, and that's why he kind of railed it back. But he's running out of soldiers, so they'll have to get them somehow.
Speak a minute on the Wagner Group. Explain what that is.
Sure. So the Wagner Group is a private military company that has been very active in civil conflicts in places like Africa. In fact, the Wagner Group just took over from French peacekeepers at the request of the Malian government. So they are a private military company that goes in and does military operations. So Putin has been good friends with the head of the Wagner Group, and he basically allowed the Wagner Group to go to Russian prisons and say, if you have served, if you join the military, you go and get trained, you go to Ukraine and you serve for 6 months, then your sentence would be commuted. And so a lot of prisoners thought this was a way better deal than staying in Russian prison. So they've gone to fight with Wagner Group, but they're not well trained. They're not very experienced. And so they really have been, to a certain degree, cannon fodder for the war. And those that have survived, the 6-month window is coming up. So it'll be interesting to see what happens to the activities of Wagner Group, because it's probably best illustrated in the battle for Bakhmut, which, had the Russians had an effective fighting force, would have been over weeks ago. The fact that the Ukrainians have been able to hold off the Russians because this is the Wagner Group's operation speaks to the weakness of the Wagner Group. And of course, the Wagner Group complains that they're not getting the adequate support from the Russian government, but I think it also has something to do with not having the highest quality of troops.
Has the purpose of the Russian war changed with their increased ties to China for economic reasons? Is China complicit in war crimes, if only indirectly, by supporting Russia with economic resources?
This is a judgment call. I'm sure very smart people would disagree. I think China has tried to tread a very careful line between trying to be supportive of its ally Russia and not incurring the wrath of Western powers. This most recent trip that she made to Moscow really towed that line quite significantly. The US has warned China that if they send military weapons to Russia, they will find out, and that will cause problems for them. And I think that was an effort to put China on notice that we know what you are potentially exporting, and we will hold you accountable. So I think potentially China could be complicity, yes.
We are almost out of time. We've got so many really interesting questions still outstanding. I think we'll just have one more, if you can fit it in. What role do you think Russia's decreasing population and declining birth rates play in Putin's motivation for this war, if any?
It may play a role in Putin seeking to unite the Russian people and maybe trying to spur some kind of nationalist sentiment to reverse this kind of decline in Russian population morale. But I think ultimately, as long as the economy is poor and people now are cut off from the rest of the world, it will be harder and harder for him to make that argument.
Yeah. I said that was the last one, but I just can't resist this final one. What about the nuclear threat? What's, where is the hands of the clock, the atomic clock?
So the US has been very careful to warn Russia at every step. You're getting closer and closer to something that's really dangerous. The most recent decision by Putin to deploy tactical nuclear weapons in Belarus certainly moves the clock closer to midnight. But I think that many experts feel that is posturing, and as a lot of Putin's nuclear rhetoric has been. So while people are concerned, I don't think people think seriously that Putin will use nuclear weapons yet. But I also think people are trying to prepare for if he does. Yeah.
Okay, I'm afraid we're out of time. Such an interesting discussion. Thank you so much, Professor Christi Siver. Thanks to the audience for coming up with such great questions. Thank you, Jason Simmons behind the scenes, and anyone else from OLLI who's behind the scenes today. Next week, we're going to welcome a familiar friend to this series. Andrew Latham will be back with a talk on energy geopolitics. I look forward to seeing all of you back again with all of your great questions. But for today, we're going to say thank you and goodbye.